Hey, this is Steve in Dallas, Texas. It's Saturday morning, my friend, and you are listening to Light Talk.
And this is Ellen coming to you from the beautiful island of St. Bart's, and this is Light Talk.
This is Stan in Gainesville, Florida, and today we're going to discuss masking and sightlines, European paperwork, service in the theater, and who owns the work. And if you don't already know, you are listening to Light Talk, and we are the Lumen Sister and Brothers with one brother on vacation.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 423. Do we have any industry news we want to share with anyone today?
It's coming up on summertime. It's the living is easy, sort of take it easy, summertime.
Well, there you go. We have no industry news today. Well, let's just go ahead and get started. Stan, you have the first question.
I do. And Cheryl in Chicago wants to know, how do you calculate sightlines and masking in your production or even your theater, and who's responsible for it? Right. Well, this comes up a bit. It's easy to say it's a collaboration between the set designer and the lighting designer and the technical director and all of that. But let me just say, sightlines are usually, like the fixed sightlines, are determined by the theater architecture, like the proscenium and where the seats are located. And that is something that I do in my theater consulting practice. And there are some rules of thumb. I would point you to the great book, Theater Design by George Eisenhower, right? It did quite a lot of studies of ancient theaters and how the Greeks did it and how the Romans did it and what the appropriate height should be and how getting seats staggered so you see between people's heads and all of that and doing that geometry. And nowadays, that's actually easier to do because you can do a layout. You can pop people or models of people in seats. You can put a camera right where their eyeball would be and give it the 50 millimeter or so beam angle of the human eye and see what the stage would look like from every seat in the house, which is, and like some of the big theater consulting firms take the time to do that when every seat matters. Every seat wants to have a good view. So you've got that. And then, of course, the way you mask the stage with your vertical legs and your horizontal borders and whatever scenery you use, you usually plop a point down somewhere in plan at what we call the extreme sight point and draw some lines and see what you see and see what you don't see. And you do the same thing in section. Sometimes the first row, sometimes the third row, if you're not worried about the people in the first and second row, and you do your vertical masking. Sometimes you pick an extreme sight point, the extreme left and right in the balcony or multiple balconies, and you see what that person's going to see. And then it's a back and forth negotiation where you change the width of masking, change the height, change which seat you're masking for. You go back and forth and you manipulate these elements until you land at what you think is the best compromise. The bigger question about who does it, sometimes in academia, I see it get neglected a lot. Then technical directors get pretty annoyed because can you give us like the masking hanging plot and where things go before, when the last show comes down so we can do it during strike for the next show? And it's sort of like pulling teeth. And sometimes who teaches it? Right? Does the lighting designer teach it? Does the set designer teach it? Where does that get communicated? So there's some questions there, and it's probably a little bit different everywhere. I don't know if there's a rule of thumb. Steve?
Well, for me, I sat down with the set designer right at the very beginning of the process before scenery is designed and have a discussion with the director about how the space is going to be used. So there's two ways, right? One way is there's nothing there and the thing is wide open and you use the architecture of the theater. The other is when they say they're dressing the stage, meaning they want masking, legs and borders put in. So we start talking about how the space is going to be used and the possibilities of where lights can be placed to achieve that. I think the thing that's a disaster for a lighting designer, at least, is that you're not active in that process of masking. And sometimes I find, in the university world, people work by themselves, and all of a sudden, I don't know, you go to production, to work on a production, and a couple months later, there's a set design that's been done, and here's all the masking in. and there's simply no place to put lights that are meaningful anymore. So you're having to compromise everything. So I think the critical thing here is to work with the set designer and the director and figure out what we're going to mask. And that first row, third row, it's who at what point do we compromise? Or do we have to compromise? Maybe everything's masked from the front row, but you certainly don't want things masked from the middle of the auditorium.
Who's responsible for teaching it, Steve, at your place? Does your set designer teacher or teach it, or who?
We all teach it. Scenery teaches it. Lighting teaches it. And our technical director is involved. And another level, our faculty who teaches drafting is involved in it. But the primary source would be the set designer and the lighting designer.
What about design choices? Like if a lighting designer puts something on the floor, like a million fluorescent tubes or LED tubes that are going to change color, but you can't see them from the first 14 rows of the orchestra, or a lot of texture and patterns on the floor, and you could only see them from the mezzanine. Um, or like boxes on stage where if you're low, you can only see their head, and if you're upstairs, you can only see their feet. So you're sort of making those choices, but you can't have 100% viewing from any seat in the theater. Then you're sort of cutting your own sight lines off.
Well, I think you try to make the best choices you can. If I'm worried in a proscenium arch theater with a balcony, if I'm worried about what the orchestra is seeing, then I'm going to lobby, and it's important. Let's say these gobos are important, and the floor is terribly important. Then I'm going to lobby long and hard that the set designer take a look at a raked stage, so that the audience on the orchestra level can have a pretty good view of what's happening. You know, in America, we seem to be terrified of rakes. Everyone's talking about, I can't walk on a rake, I'm going to fall over. Well, it depends on the rake you put in and how severe it is. But I've been in dozens of theaters in Europe in which their theater is a raked theater. And I've gone through there with ballet companies that have no trouble with it. For some reason in America, we freak out every time someone says there's going to be a rake on the stage. But that's how I would approach that. Um, when you say fluorescent lights on the floor, do you mean the actual tube is sitting on the floor,
Yeah,
or I
I
just
saw
see?
an opera once where there were, I don't know if it was neon tubes or fluorescent tubes, but they sort of created like a rolling sea effect throughout the entire production, except that most of the people downstairs couldn't see them. And it was quite beautiful when you were in the right seat.
Sure. I think what happens on that, I've forgotten the piece. I should know it. I think it's called Music for 22. It's an improvisation. It's a structured improvisational piece of percussion and piano, and the conductor makes choices on what they're going to play, the order they're going to play it in, and how many times it's going to repeat. I lit that with, I don't know, 200 light bulbs on the floor. And the thing was, you have to have a director or a conductor in this instance that's going to buy into this. And you have to give in this case, you have to give the musicians a reasonable path to their instruments. You don't want them skipping over something or having to do anything weird. You want a clear path that they can get to where they're going without looking awkward as they walk in or tripping over something. So I think once you start putting lights on the floor, there's a lot of considerations. It's just part of the game of design. And someone says that's a good idea, or someone says that's a terrible idea, and you either pursue it or you don't pursue it.
I think you have to. I think when it comes to these questions, particularly in a theater with seats at different levels, you have to do a study. You have to evaluate it. You just don't throw it up there and not really. I wouldn't even present it to a group unless I've studied it, thoroughly. And I wouldn't want to be caught in a meeting and realize I didn't consider half the audience in my what I was presenting. So I think you have to do your diligence before you put something like that up there.
I think the most important thing about a sight line, I learned uh, when I started doing dance from Carla Maxwell, who was the artistic director of the Lamone Company. We were somewhere, and I was just kind of starting my tenure with the company, and she came and got me, and she took me to an extreme seat in the theater. And she said, sit there and look at the stage. And it didn't look as good as sitting in the king's chair in the middle of the auditorium. And I said, I mean, I was in my late 20s maybe. And I said, well, Carla, this is the worst seat in the house. And she said, darling, someone's paying $100 for that seat.
That's right. That's
And
right.
so that was really, a real important lesson to learn. Someone is sitting here and they deserve the very best. I mean,
Best you can give them, the best you can give
yeah,
them.
you can't
Yep.
make the worst seat the best seat.
Right.
Generally, you can do a lot better for it. So I think that's the compromise we hear a lot is, well, it's a matinee or, oh, it's the worst seat or what do you expect from the third balcony? Well, those people who are coming expect quite a bit.
So Sam from Austin asks, is paperwork different from the US to Europe? I will be lighting an opera for a festival in Italy this summer and to expect. So Steve, you've done some international work.
It is weird. It depends on the theater you're going into. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it is a monster theater or a small theater somewhere in the countryside. They all kind of seem to function differently. Um, I try to do a light plot for every theater I go into and send that to them before I arrive. Um, and that light plot is in metric. And I also use the equipment that they have in their house. I don't use a symbol for a source for and call it something else. I draft the symbol that is legitimate for the light they have. So I try to give them as much information as I can on a piece of paper before I get there. And usually that's pretty successful. Sometimes I get to a theater and they've kind of ignored my paperwork. And what they've pointed out is they are a repertory house. And so they have a matinee of an opera, and that ends at 5 o'clock, and they have to flip the stage into the ballet, which goes up at 8:30 or 9. So they're not about to hang anything that I've actually asked for because after the performance, they got to flip it back into the stage play for the next day. So we will sit down and go through their repertory plot, and I will circle on a piece of paper everything I want. And sometimes they will even patch that the way I want it patched. Sometimes I say, I'd like these four lights to be channels 1 through 4 because it's easy for my paperwork, right? I just say, let me have channels 1 through 4. It's a side light. I know what it is. And I may have to monkey with the intensity because of the light difference. But sometimes they'll say, no, those are lights 31, 41, 51, and 61, and they will not repatch. And that's, it's no point arguing with them. That's what they're going to do. So you have to change your magic sheet to reflect that. I have been at places, particularly in Russia, and I'm talking St. Petersburg, uh, where they actually want to hang my show, but they don't want to use my light plot. And we will sit there, and the electrician will walk out there. At the time, he was not using Vectorworks; he was using a piece of paper and pencil. But he would draft the plot as we hang it, and he would draft it in ink because he didn't want any changes made. And he was very proud of his ability to draft beautifully, and he could draft beautifully. Um, so it's a shooting match. The pre-production you can do is important. The other thing that's kind of important is if you're going to some festival or some theater where perhaps you know of someone in the industry who has been there to work, doesn't have to be your friend. It would be worth your time, to call them up and say, tell me what it is. I did file sharing with Alvin Ailey and Martha Graham and Limon all the time. So my electrician or associate would call them up and say, we're going to the such and such theater in, I don't know, Warsaw. Have you been there? Do you have any information for us? And I still have a filing cabinet full of ground plans, equipment lists, all that stuff for all the theaters we ever went to. So I could, send that to someone who was asking me questions. So I think finding someone who's worked there before you is never a bad idea. And it's not that hard. If you're based in New York, it's not that hard, particularly if you're a dance company.
I haven't done that, so I can't really weigh in on taking my paperwork to Europe. But I'm just reminded of something because Steve was talking about talking to people who have been there and gathering information. I remember back in the 80s, maybe even 90s, and Steve might remember this person. I'm going to invoke her name and see if it rings a bell. But there was a woman, and I wonder if she's out there. I wonder if she's a listener. Her name was Donna Brady, and she was like a stage management lighting design type. She was a friend of mine, and she developed this thing. Maybe Ellen remembers, called the Technical Assistance Project in New York, and its goal was to gather lighting plans, plots, and information from all the designers who were working around the world and create a repository for it and then share that information. If you were going to Theater X, you could contact the TAP, the technical assistant, and say, hey, I'm going to X theater. Do you have any data? And I don't know if it ever really, does that ring a bell with you guys at all or not at all?
It does with me. I think it's we always say this. I think it's a small community,
Yeah.
and I think particularly, if you're touring, then kind of everybody is touring. It's not like you're a rock show going there. And even if you're doing something in the opera world, there are plenty of American designers who are working there that all you have to do is reach out.
You are listening to Light Talk, and today Light Talk will be sponsored by
Pet Sweat of Japan. If you've been in the biz long enough, you've probably heard the term chewing the scenery. When a critic says, wow, Bob is really chewing the scenery tonight, they're not complimenting his snack habits. No, they're referring to an actor who's overacting and going completely over the top in a melodramatic role. But now, Pet Sweat of Japan has taken chewing the scenery to a whole new level, introducing amazing grazing backdrops, completely edible stage curtains. That's right, now strike is literally a piece of cake. Try our three most popular soft goods. Who needs a shark's tooth scrim when you can have the mocha scrim? A backdrop so rich in flavor and drama that you will savor every moment. It's the only scrim that pairs perfectly well with a cappuccino and a passionate monologue while filling the theater with the rich fragrance of coffee. Who needs velour legs and borders when you can have chocolate legs and borders? Because every stage needs a little more sweetness. And why not have the sweetness come from the set? They're delicious enough to make your leading actor forget their lines. A perfect addition to any nutcracker. And finally, who needs a dirty off-white cyc when you can have a peaches and cream cyclorama, a soft, silky backdrop that glows with a gentle, edible radiance? It's the perfect visual for those tender scenes, and you'll definitely want to bite into it when the director yells break. It makes any recital come to life with a magical stage glowing like an ice cream social. Life is a cabaret, my friends, so make it delicious. Insist on Pet Sweat for all your scenic needs. Pet Sweat of Japan, always something good in the kitchen.
best sponsor you've had in a while, Steve. I must say, I want to buy some of those. And now back to Light Talk.
And today's Let's Talk About is all about, do directors and producers have the right to alter work that isn't theirs? Good question, guys. What do you think?
Complicated in the 21st century.
Well, if you didn't read your contract carefully, maybe you gave them permission to alter your work.
That's a good point. You shouldn't sign anything you haven't read, which people do all the time. And then they make the font like 6 points, so you can't read it without a magnifying glass.
Right.
That's what make you suspicious in the
That's
first
what they
place.
call the small print.
Well, also I mean, I don't want to get off on contracts right now, but I mean, if you've never had a contract other than I'm going to pay you X for showing up for 4 days, and you don't know how to read a contract, maybe you need to have a an agent. I mean, we're talking something that has a little bit of money with it. There are agents who will represent you on a show by show basis. Maybe you should have an agent look at your contract before you just flip to the 10th page of it and put your John Henry on there. Maybe you have a lawyer look at your contract. And almost any lawyer who does contracts can look at it and say, here's some warning signs right here. Do you know this is in your contract? So if you've never read one, you don't know what to look for. It's not hubris to have someone help you.
I've been in situations where a director has decided to like pull a song from the second act and have it close the first act, or get rid of it altogether, or something else. And then even someone maybe from Samuel French or whoever owns the rights to the play, or if it's a living playwright, living composer, might show up to the dress rehearsal or something and go, "Oh no, you have to put that back. You didn't have the right to do that." And they override the director's choice on how to present the order of the evening.
Well, I think people forget that we all work for a producer.
Right.
We have a director who's in charge of the artistry of the evening, and we are working with that director to help them produce something. But the producer can walk in at any time and make a change.
Only once in my career have I been a producer. We were sort of backers, angel investors in a production that's now actually running, has been running now, and we finally just reached the point where we've recouped our original investment. But we got a contract, or sometimes they call it like a card deck of slides, and it was a contract. And when you're sort of investigating something, you get excited, which we did, and we thought, oh, we just want to be part of this, and so we didn't maybe read it as carefully. And interestingly, I thought if this thing succeeded, which it has in a modest way, but we just got a distribution check, in fact, this month. And so now we're in the black, if you will. We were in the red for a while. But the point is that the playwright, who is the original artist, who really has the rights, which the producer buys or licenses, I didn't really know, and it wasn't in our contract, that the playwright, after a certain number of years, becomes the sole owner of the work. And so those of us who invested to get it started, our payback will eventually end after like a decade or two. And I didn't know that, because it is about looking at fine print. But I do think Steve's right. I guess the artistic work is licensed from the playwright, but I would imagine that the playwright has some pretty significant protections, even to protect their work from a producer meddling. Is that I've only done a little bit of original work, but Steve, do you have any knowledge about that?
Well, I think we continue this conversation um, and add Janet into it, who has written a question to us that ties into this. Uh, and her question says, "I'm about to work on a new play, and the playwright will be on site for 2 weeks. What should I expect?" Uh, I think unless you work with a playwright, you might be surprised. They have a lot of control over the show. The playwright is the copyright holder of a show. From the moment the play is written until 70 years after he or she dies, he's the only person or she's the only person who can change anything. The director can ask for changes, but only the playwright can say yes or no. Back in the day, uh, Edward Albee used to come down to the University of Houston, I believe, and do playwriting classes. And whenever he was in Houston, he would then make a side trip up to SMU, and he would come here and he would meet with our design students. And he was an interesting kind of guy. Um, we were talking about his work as a playwright and his control. When he did Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and it was licensed, I guess, by MGM, I think, they assured him they didn't need to put it in a contract. That's the first warning sign, but he was a younger playwright. We don't need to put it in the contract, but of course, you're going to have a lot of say in who is cast in the show. And they allowed him to start rehearsals of the movie with James Mason and Betty Davis. That's who he wanted to play the role. And he said he was in rehearsal with them in Manhattan when he got a phone call one day. And they said, "Hey, we got Liz and Dick." And then he said there was a click on the phone. So if you don't know who Liz and Dick are, that's Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And they had signed them because they were monster stars. Certainly well, but much better known names for that generation than Betty Davis and James Mason. But I mean, they completely stripped him of his rights because he didn't put in his contract. He said in his contract now he has exclusivity over everything. He never enforces it if it's a university or regional theater, but he says if it's in Manhattan, there's only one way to do the play, and it's my way, or you don't do it at
So
all.
does that go to design choices as well? Like a living playwright shows up and you say, well, we're going to do, your play set in, World War II Germany. And he says, no, I'm sorry. It was written in 1940s Maine and it's going to be US based, not German based. And you're like, yes, but so that they have design superiority also?
Well, it depends on which contract says, which brings you into property rights, approvals, and exclusivity. So, as a playwright, they look pretty close at those three
Right, right.
paragraphs, and I mean, we were in class together one day, and his phone rang, and he said, "I'm sorry, I have to take that. It's my agent." And it was like the phone call lasted maybe 15, 20 seconds. It was, "Oh, I see. We'll tell them to stop." One of his works was in a revival in New York, and they had developed a ground plan, they had developed a model, and they felt pretty good about letting this go to bid. And he went, "No, it's not going anywhere until I see it." And I've had a conversation with it. So I don't know if he accepted it as it was or if he rejected it, but he certainly rejected it without seeing it. Jane Greenwood talks about this. Uh, she was doing a Tennessee Williams play, and Tennessee was there. He'd been there for a month. He'd gone through the last of the rehearsals. They had gone through tech and dress together, and they had their first preview. And he walked up to her and very quietly said, when I wrote that, I always imagined her in a peach colored chiffon dress." And that's not what was on stage. And she went immediately to the producer and director and said, "We got to change costume. I got to get a peach chiffon dress on stage." Now, he didn't insist on that, but I mean, it wasn't an accident that he walked up to the costume designer and said that to her, even though he had seen it for weeks.
So, Steve, that makes me think about this sort of docudrama that I recently watched called The Offer, which is about Al Ruddy, who was the producer of The Godfather. And we don't often get a close look at the role of the producer necessarily in the world. And this was Al produced it himself to tell the story behind the scenes of how The Godfather was brought to the stage. And it involves casting, it involves Paramount, some really, you know, colorful characters, and the tension, and not to mention the relationship with the actual mafia and their relationship in the making of the film, which I had no idea how deep that went. And it's a fascinating study in the relationship between the actors, the casting, the women, in fact, and the secretaries at the time who were involved in it. It's a fascinating study on producing something, and all of those complications that you guys are describing. I found it wonderful, beautifully done and compelling. So it's called The Offer, and Al Ruddy, whose name I did not know until somebody said, "You need to watch this," and it was absolutely fascinating. So I just share that as a way to kind of get an insight into the producing side of works of dramas.
Circling back to Janet there, what should I expect? I can't tell you what to expect. I mean, some playwrights are very involved in bringing their work to the stage. And other playwrights are happy it's being produced and they just want to kind of hear the words and do some rewrites. So it can be anything. Uh, Generally, I've done about 20 maybe new plays, and what I find is generally The playwright will talk very privately with the director. It is rare that the playwright will walk up to me and say, "This needs to be blue." That everybody's a professional in the theater. I've never seen a playwright uh, say something to an actor that I believe the director wasn't prepared for. So I think there's a lot of private conversation that goes on over coffee between the director and the playwright, and they present a unified front to everyone. Uh, I was looking at the playwright's contracts, and they're making no judgments here, but they said three important things when you read your contract. The first is property rights. Does this contract say that you are the sole owner of your work? That no changes will be made without your permission, and that any approved changes will be made during the rehearsal process. So, I mean, that clearly says you can't monkey with the show once it goes on to previews. Approvals. Do you have approval over cast, director, and designers? Because, let's face it, the producer is going to hire the playwright before they're going to get that property before they're going to get a designer and a director team on board. So do you have the approval of cast, director, and designers? Um, and you should always have approval or mutual approval over creative process of a new play. The phrase you want to watch out for in your contract is meaningful consultation, which that's really open to interpretation. So what you may think is meaningful and what the director may think is meaningful is two different things. So you want to avoid those phrases like that. And getting back to where Stan was with the show he produced, is the producer asking for sole and exclusive rights? I mean, are you signing this thing away forever? You need to look at your contract. What are you actually saying they can do with it? Um, so I'm sure Arthur Miller would not want The Crucible turned into a comic musical. But if you are you signing everything away when you sign that contract? I look at that in my own contract for the work that I've done for a number of companies in dance. I control those designs. And if they are going to send that license out to a ballet to do that piece, and that ballet company may have that piece for a month or they may have it for a year. Inside that licensing fee is a fee for my work to be reproduced because it's still my work. I don't want someone else monkeying with it. And the ballet company that's licensing it should not want someone to monkey with it. They're licensing it for a very specific reason. So playwrights, I've always had a good experience with them.
I'm thinking about an artwork that I got to work on at the Smithsonian that was painted. So it's a painter, but it had lighting. This was by a very famous painter named David Hockney. And this was an installation at Smithsonian that was lit with very early Verilight color changing fixtures. And I was asked to work with them to um, modernize it and sort of maybe even alter it somewhat, to monkey with it, to use Steve's words, and to also shift it from incandescent color changing to LED. And I felt a little bit apprehensive about doing it, and they let us play with it and experiment with some new ideas. And then the curator said, no, we're not going to do that. Let's stay true to Hockney's cues, which were in the board. And then we ended up being absolutely as true to the original work as possible. But in this case, to Steve's point, the way that installation was done, Smithsonian bought the work from Hockney. So they did not have to. They could have done anything. We could have done anything they approved that we wanted to, but which we did explore, but then we ended up going back and saying, no, let's stay as true to the original as we possibly can. And that's what we did, more out of respect than out of contract. So sometimes it can be the contract, but sometimes you have something called, some of us have or try to have morals and ethics, and we ended up, following that path.
I think as a designer, Janet, you don't want to take sides. You don't want to pick the playwright over the director. Uh, you want to treat them both with equal respect, knowing that the producer has also picked that director for a reason. So, you know, if the director feels the playwright is being inappropriate, let the director and the producer do that fight. Don't come in one day and say, well, the playwright told me we need a snow machine on stage. I mean, that would be like the worst thing in the world, is to do that. So be respectful, kind of try to stay with the chain of command, understanding that they both have very strong voices in how a show gets to the
Right,
stage.
because there could be design changes that come in late in the game if there are rewrites and the scene is taken away or changed, or the sunlight becomes moonlight, or it's a day scene that becomes a night scene or something else.
I've seen all of that. I've seen scenery cut. I've seen pages of dialogue cut. The playwright has walked into the next page with 20 blue pages. The blue pages are where the script has been changed, so you can quickly find them when you put them into your script. All of that is there. But at the end of the day, everybody wants a good-looking show on stage. And depending on where you are, I mean, if you're in New York, that's one thing. If you're in Chattanooga, that's something else. So you just have to kind of go with the flow there a bit.
Well, the rocking sounds of the Luminoids tell us that once again, you've spent another morning listening to Light Talk. You can hear our show on just about every podcast site out there. Check out our website on lighttalk.org and be sure to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our podcast. That way you will not miss a second of Light Talk insanity.
No guarantee is offered regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on this podcast. However,
if you do decide to litigate, you will be dealing with me, Snoot, from the Snoot Group. And you don't want to with me, because I will make your life unbearably miserable as I drain the retirement funds from these Lumen bozos.
Light Talk is written and produced by the Lumen Brothers and Sister, coming to you from St. Bart's, Gainesville, and the Lone Star State.
And be sure to join us next week when we talk about more lighting shenanigans and serve you more of our casserole of nonsense.
Light Talk, broadcasting questionable Lumen knowledge and humor around the world.
We'll see you all next Saturday morning. Bye-bye from Light Talk.
Bye-bye.